Now, what I'd like to talk about this morning is Daniel. Now, Daniel is one of those guys that are very familiar in terms of characters in the Bible. And in fact, he's one of those characters that we kind of like as modern Americans. Modern Americans love the celebrity testimony, right? I was a Denver Broncos fan. I am a Denver Broncos fan. And it was kind of fun last year when Tim Tebow was the quarterback for the Broncos. And every time I would turn on my computer, there's somebody talking about Tim Tebow. And Tim Tebow had this wonderful testimony, and Christians just loved it because we love celebrity testimonies. And it doesn't matter if it's a football player, we'll do a rock star, politician, whatever it is, we love those sorts of celebrity characters. And it is interesting to think about that. It isn't just kind of an American issue. You can actually find that in the Bible. We don't have to think it up. You think of some of the people that you encounter in Scripture, and you realize these are great stories. You know, think of Moses. The guy's abandoned as a baby, thrown into a river. He's rescued from the river, brought to the palace, grows up in the palace, is educated by Pharaoh's, household. Then he goes off and he commits murder and ends up for 40 years as a fugitive in the desert. And then he comes back and he calls down a plague of frogs. I mean, is that cool or what? And then he gets to go out, lead 2 million people through the desert and part the Red Sea. I mean, if that doesn't get you on Oprah, what would? So we do these celebrity things, and Daniel is one of those kind of guys. I mean, he is just a flannel graph waiting to happen. Okay, so maybe it's now a VeggieTale waiting to happen, or whatever it is that you guys do now, but He's got lion den things going on. He's got these great big pillars that everyone's bowing down to. He has, these images and visions and dreams and all these incredible things that are part of Daniel's life. And so when you hear I'm going to talk about Daniel, my bet is that it's all of that wonderful celebrity testimony that might come to mind. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about something very different. Here's my worry. I have no problem with God doing wonderful things and people having great testimonies. It is a great thing. So, no problem. But here's my worry about that. If that's all we think of, then we think that the really important thing about the Christian life are the exceptional things about the Christian life. And we begin to think that the ordinary part of our life isn't really very important. And it doesn't really matter for our testimony. And so when we think of a guy like Daniel and his testimony, what does he have to say about what God has done? We think of these dreams and these visions and these fiery furnaces and these lions' dens. But we forget the fact that Daniel was a guy who had a very ordinary job. My favorite verse in the book of Daniel reads like this. Daniel 1:21. And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. Real spellbinder, isn't it? Let me let you in on a secret. It's really easy to memorize. Huh? And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. Let's try that. And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. See, you've done it. No wonder I like this verse, right? Now, I would like to point out, though, that there is something far more remarkable about this verse than it might appear. And that's because Daniel 1 is describing events that took place in 605 BC. When Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem, it was the first of kind of 3 progressive falls into exile that, befell the nation of Israel. And he let out a batch of sort of aristocratic nobles that he took out of Jerusalem and brought back to Babylon, and Daniel was among them. That's 605 BC. You know when Cyrus became king? 539. Basically, this is 70 years later. And it's all summarized in one verse. And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. 70 years. That's impressive. I did a little checking on the internet. The average tenure of a CEO, 8.1 years. The average tenure of an NFL head coach, 4.1 years. The average tenure of a pastor in a church, 3.6. And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. 70 years later. I want you to stop and think for just a moment all the things that could have made Daniel quit. 70 years. Talk about same-o, same-o. I mean, this isn't just, I've been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. He's got the t-shirt, he's got the coffee cup, got the key ring. He's probably got the bobblehead. I mean, at some point, what is there that you haven't done after you've been there and remaining for 70 years? And I'd like to point out, for all these cool stories that you have in Daniel, they're really very few to fill up 70 years. Most of the time, we simply have no idea what Daniel was doing. And I don't mean we don't know what he did for certain years. I mean we don't know what he did for certain decades. It wasn't necessarily a continuous pile of glamorous jobs. He had a couple good dreams right at the beginning. He had one real winner right in the middle. And then there's this one thing at the end, but to be honest, by that time, everybody could see the handwriting on the wall, right? And so you start thinking, what did this guy actually do for 70 years? He remained exactly where God had put him. And Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now, you may be thinking it's because he had a great work environment. Really? Daniel's work environment was unrelentingly bad. I did a little section in my Jesus Lord of All class a couple of weeks ago on vocation. And it was sort of just like Todd said, my theology of everything, so we did a theology of work. And how do we understand work theologically? And it's kind of a lead-in. I had students share things that made for good jobs and bad jobs. So we had this kind of conversation about this, and it was kind of fun to hear some of the good jobs people had and what made them good, the bad jobs people had, what made them bad. And it was interesting. Two things came really, really quickly to the top. One is the quality of your coworkers, and the other was the quality of your bosses. And I just want you to stop and think a minute about Daniel's coworkers. Have you read the book of Daniel? My stars. I don't know who you're working with at Starbucks or wherever, but these guys are really a case. They're power hungry, they're foolish, they're incompetent, they're jealous, they're petty, greedy, immoral. They're knuckleheads. All of them. Unrelentingly for 70 years. Every time you meet his coworkers, it's just a disaster. I mean, other than that, they were okay, but these guys really have problems. And despite that fact, Daniel remained until the first year of Cyrus the king. And what about his bosses? Gee whiz. You know, you meet these guys. I don't know what your boss does that you don't like, but I want you to try this one on for size. If you don't worship me, I'll throw you in a fiery furnace. I mean, that has got to make a dent in employee morale at some point. These are the guys that Daniel's working with. Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, he is so full of himself. Unbelievable. Finally, God kind of calls the question on him in Daniel chapter 4, and he repents, but even after Daniel warns him, he doesn't get the message. And these guys, so Nebuchadnezzar literally ends up spending 7 years crawling around eating grass. What's your boss do that bothers you? So he's not working in a great work environment here. And then when things go wrong, I love the language. When these guys get upset, it's like, I'm going to kill you, and then I'll rip you to pieces, and then I'll smash your houses, and then I'll throw you in a fiery furnace, and then I'll unfriend you on Facebook. I mean, these guys just would blow their top. I can't imagine being a therapist for Nebuchadnezzar. Doctor, I had a dream. Tell me about the dream. No, I don't want to. Well, how did the dream make you feel? It made me feel like tearing you up, ruining your house, and killing you. And so he does. And then he calls in Daniel. And he says to Daniel, Daniel, I need a new therapist. And Daniel says, not again. You've torched your therapist. I mean, this guy had a real anger problem throughout the whole course of the time. And Daniel remains until the first year of Cyrus the king. And it's interesting as you see this progression, you would tend to think as you read through Daniel 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, you would think that Daniel is on this path of kind of ascendancy. But when you meet him in Daniel 5, it's a really interesting story. Belshazzar is having this feast, and he's invited all the big mucky mucks, and suddenly this disembodied hand appears on the back wall and starts writing, many, many tekel parson, which means in Hebrew, you're in deep doo-doo. And no one knew what it meant, and so they're all in a tizzy. The queen overhears the discussion, and she says, wait a minute, I remember this guy who is good at things like this. And they have to go dig out Daniel from some dark corner of the bureaucracy of Babylon. And then they bring him in, they have to introduce him to the king. At this point, he's been working for him for the better part of 7 decades. He has been neglected, he has been forgotten, they have to go find him in a time of need. And then, of course, they finally give him all the big presents, and the guy dies before the night is over, and you've got a new king who comes rolling in. Welcome to Daniel's life. And Daniel remained in his job for 70 years. Now, I don't want to argue that no one should ever change jobs. I think that would be a bad implication to draw from this passage. But I would like to argue that there's some really meaningful things we could draw from this passage about how we actually live our lives. And I'd like to just identify a few of those lessons that you might think about, and might even be some things that you could apply even here and now in Biola before this semester is over. 3 things that we learned from Daniel. One is that it's God's job to exalt people and to humble people. And it's my job to be faithful and to be righteous. This is one of those things at work that often bothers people, is when they don't get the credit they deserve. Have you ever done that? Ever come up with a brilliant idea that somebody else takes? You do the perfect thing to make the whole thing work and no one notices, no one cares, and somebody else gets the promotion or the reward. We really like to get what we deserve, at least when we deserve good things. One of the interesting things about Daniel is he's very unrelenting in presenting to anyone who will listen the fact that the things he does are not things that he does on his own power, but things that are there to reveal God. And so when he has to reveal a dream, he is very explicit about saying that it was a thing that he himself couldn't do, but God had to do for him. So you see this in Daniel chapter 2 when Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and he doesn't want to tell anybody what it was, and he's going to kill all the wise men. Like I say, anger problem. Daniel hears about it and says, you know what, let me go seek God. And he seeks God, and God gives him the vision. And then Daniel is brought before the king, and he answers the king in chapter 2, verse 27. He says, no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And he points his finger to God as the source of the gift he's about to give, the gift of interpretation. And then the interesting thing is to see how the king ultimately answers when he talks to Daniel. He says, truly your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and the revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. He understands that Daniel had revealed the mystery, but he praises God because of how Daniel presented all of this. God was the one who ended up being glorified. In chapter 3, though we don't have Daniel, we have his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're supposed to bow down and worship. They don't. They get it brought before the king, who gets very upset, wants to throw them in a fiery furnace. And he says, the friends say to him, you can go ahead and do that. And our God whom we serve is able to deliver us out of the burning fiery furnace. And he'll deliver us out of your hand, O king. And by the way, if he doesn't, we're not going to worship you anyhow. Now that got him just all the more upset, but it's interesting to see what happens when God actually saves them. And they say, therefore, the king says, I decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be reduced to a rubbish heap. Yeah, welcome to Babylon. Interesting how even this outraged king can be brought back to glorify God. And then notice the statement he issues at the end is one of praise to God and also concern for the honor of God. It doesn't necessarily say anything about what happens if you speak about these three guys, but it tells you something about if you speak about their God. Likewise in Daniel 4, after Nebuchadnezzar's mind is restored to him, he says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, now praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride because of Daniel's testimony. And likewise in Daniel 6 with the lion's den. The king is throwing him in, he doesn't want to, and he says, maybe your God can save you. The king comes the next morning to find out, and he asks, was your God able to save you? And Daniel answers, oh, live forever, my king. My God has sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth. And again, the king makes a decree that in all his royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. He unrelentingly pointed to God, and people saw it and praised God as a result. It's a wonderful testimony. It's a wonderful testimony. The second thing that Daniel did was he cultivated excellence and righteousness in the midst of mediocrity and sin. As I already pointed out, his co-workers, these guys were just trouble. They had bad morality, they had bad practice, and they were basically not very good at their job, it would appear. You get these four guys in from Jerusalem, you give them that education, you check them out as their first pass, and the king says in Daniel chapter 1, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all the kingdom. They were excellent in their studies. Chapter 5, it talks about Daniel again, and calls a man whom an excellent spirit is found. And it has knowledge and understanding and wisdom. Daniel chapter 6, he was distinguished among all the other high officials because an excellent spirit was in him. And the kings planned to set him over the whole kingdom. In the midst of mediocrity, Daniel chose excellence. And I might encourage you to stop and think, how do you do? Do you play down to your competition? Is grading on the curve your salvation? What do you do when it comes time to consider excellence? Paul makes an interesting comment in Colossians 3 when he talks about work, and he calls us to do all things heartily as unto the Lord. And he's telling you not to let your coworkers or your fellow students be your guide, but rather to let Christ be your God, because it is the Lord Christ you are pleasing. So let me just give a couple of tips for those of you who might want to shun mediocrity and pursue excellence. Even here as a student, even now, even today. First of all, let me remind you that the most important thing that you learn in college is not facts, but habits. That will be the greatest inheritance you have, and the legacy you bring from Biola is the habits that you have formed. Your facts aren't that cool. That's what the internet is for, right? But your habits are invaluable. And they are the place in which excellence will be found. In fact, let me encourage you to just make excellence a habit. Do things well. Here's another thought. Prepare ahead, and you won't need excuses for being behind. Now, I don't want to sound too much like a cranky professor, but I would like to point out that one of the things that absolutely kills us when it comes to excellence is I just don't have time. And so often the reason that you don't have time to finish well is because you didn't choose to make time to start well. And you start well by starting early. Now, please don't hear me wrong. I am not standing in front of you as a guy who figured that out when I was in college. I didn't. I didn't figure it out when I went through my whole first master's program. I remember the moment I figured it out, when at that point I was in part of my PhD program. I had just had a baby, we had just bought a house, and I was walking in to try and get this floor tiled before we moved everybody in from our apartment that was about to close, and I looked at the calendar, and it finally dawned on me that I had a major term paper due in my class 2 days later that I hadn't started. And I realized I was in trouble. I won't belabor that experience, but I will make one observation. I did not write an excellent paper. That is probably, of all the things I did in that entire graduate program, the one item I am least proud of. I would be happy to forget that entire experience. Actually, the good news is I pretty much have forgotten. I don't even remember what I put in that paper because I didn't give it enough time. And it's not because of what it was like at the end. It was what it was like 10 weeks earlier when I knew that was going to be my due date. And I started late, so I finished poorly. And I did not produce an excellent product. It's interesting that Daniel's whole story about the vegetables, the magic Daniel diet, starts right at the beginning. There's a 3-year training process, but we see it right at the beginning where Daniel said, we're going to start and do this thing right from the word go. And 3 years later, he had a wonderful product. But that's partly because at the beginning of that whole process, he started well. Third thing that's interesting to learn from Daniel is that Daniel proclaimed God by name in contrast and in opposition to the worship of his surrounding culture. A lot of times when we talk about excellence and that we should be excellent as Christians, we will talk about excellence in our lives, in our work, in our relationships, as some sort of a replacement for the verbal proclamation of the gospel. And I would like to point out that that is exactly not what you see happen with Daniel. All of the excellence of his entire life, his incredible persistence, his magical moments of miracles, and his brutal faithfulness through decades of basically neglect and being forgotten, all of those wonderful and excellent deeds that he showed were not a replacement for his verbal witness and testimony to God. He always was explicit about where his wisdom, his power, and his strength came from. He was always explicit about where praise should go, and that praise should go back to God. And the bottom line is, if we're excellent, people will tend to praise our excellence. People will tend to think that we're good people. And there is no immediate connection between being a good person and being a follower of Christ. We bridge that gap with our words. We bridge that gap when we put a label on our deeds. And the interesting thing with Daniel is he did this very well. Like I say, it was you can tell, this is a nasty environment culturally. Daniel didn't go into hiding. He didn't go into hiding. He prayed publicly so everyone knew he was doing it. He always talked about this to the king or whoever it was he was talking to, very transparent about his faith. And in verse 14, chapter 2, 14, there's an interesting phrase when Nebuchadnezzar is all upset and he's about to kill all of the wise men because they won't interpret the dream. And Daniel, it says, answered the representative of the king who had come to kill everybody. He said he answered him with prudence and discretion. Daniel was very wise in terms of how he shared the gospel, but he was very faithful to share it verbally nonetheless. And I think that's part of why we back away from our verbal witness, is because we have not learned to give our verbal witness with prudence and discretion. Sometimes when people say they're being persecuted for their faith, and I hear how they respond to others, I kind of go, dude, I don't think you're being persecuted for your faith. I think you're being persecuted because you're obnoxious. Learn a little prudence. Learn a little discretion. Peter commands us to be prepared to give a defense, but we're supposed to do that with gentleness and respect. Daniel does this with prudence and discretion. 2 Timothy 2, he talks about Timothy as being commanded by Paul to correct people with gentleness so that God might perhaps lead them to repentance. You know what happens a lot of times when you live in an antagonistic culture like ours is to the Christian faith? You want to strike back. It becomes a Jonah-like thing where you want to call down judgment rather than see repentance. And God says, if you want people to actually repent, you need to give them a place to stand. So learn to answer people with gentleness, with respect, with prudence and discretion. Speak the truth, but speak the truth in love. Speak through your actions, but also speak the truth in word, so that ultimately God might be glorified by the testimony of your life. And my guess is it'll be far more important for you to be faithful in all the ordinary, boring, long-term things, just like Daniel was, rather than hoping for the miracle. Because for most of us, our testimony will be born of our ordinary life. And it's my prayer that yours would be an extraordinary testimony.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.